And this thing of Yunus alayhi salam is another example. Look, Yunus alayhi salam was swallowed by, it says, فَالْتَقَمَهُ الْحُوتُ وَهُوَ مُلِيمٌ. Al-Hut. Now, scholars have spoken about this. What kind, is this possible from a natural perspective? Well, they've spoken, yes, it is possible. There are several kind of creatures within the sea, including like the large whales, the sperm whale, or the whale shark. These kind of animals that do not actually have teeth. And they have several chambers. And the esophagus is actually very large. And what they do is they process food by taking it into one chamber, which first of all just kind of compresses the food, then pushes it into another chamber to further digest. And it takes a process. Now the Qur'an, unlike the Bible, which mentions that Jonah was in the whale's stomach for 3 days, as Jesus, for example, acknowledges, and that the Son of God will also, will also return after 3 days as Jonah did. But in the Quran there's no mention of the period of time that Jonah was swallowed. Yunus alayhi salam. All it mentions is that he was swallowed, and this naturally, now you think, well, he was swallowed and then thrown out by this whale. There's several accounts of animals. For example, you can Google, there's accounts of sailors recovering after a few days their dogs that had been swallowed by certain whales. There's other accounts which you can, nowadays you can search these kind of things online. One of the questions is, well, if you were taken in, you would have been compressed, because the esophagus is quite wide, and the first chamber, there would have been a certain amount of oxygen that comes in, but you would have been like pressed on, not crushed entirely, but almost depressed heavily. This would result in you suffering immensely. Now, what does the Quran say? That فَالْتَقَمَهُ الْحُوتُ that the وَهُوَ مُلِيمٌ, and then فَنَبَذَهُ بِالْعَرَاءِ, that then this hut that swallowed Yunus kind of threw him out. وَهُوَ سَقِيمٌ, and he was immensely sick and ill as a consequence of this. Now, how long did this process take place? Was it just an hour? Was it less than an hour? Was it more than an hour? Allah doesn't mention these things. But it's not impossible. One thing, the Quran doesn't mention it in any supernatural kind of way that he was a superhero. Look, he was swallowed and then he fought the whale and jumped out. It doesn't mention it. In fact, it mentions when he was thrown out, he was heavily sick and kind of like as a consequence of what had happened to him. So these things are not anti-reason in that sense. Yes, one would say these events are highly unlikely, and the Quran explains it as a very unlikely event that it would happen, but not impossible. So I hope that's of some help. Let's move on, folks. Alright, those of you just tuning in, click like, click share, people. And suffocation, and look, another good example is people who've drowned, for example. There's many people who do drown, but are resuscitated after hours. I mean, you can read reports of people having drowned at poolsides or other things and being recovered and resuscitated after, or in certain waters, after hours. 15 hours, 17 hours, there's reports about these things. So I'm just saying that when you look at these things, take it into a whole context, that's all. I hope that's of some help. And I don't know why, you see, one thing we need to understand is, why is Allah mentioning these things? So you can take a lesson from it. Not to kind of, oh, this is to draw this kind of, Allah did these things in a vacuum, we're now going to go against science because Allah has given us the manual to oppose science. That's nonsense. Allah's never said any of these things. Okay, people, let's take a look. What else are we looking at?